Hello everyone, in this short video I'm going to discuss the introduction to the elements of literary works. So here there are two kinds of elements, which are the extrinsic and the intrinsic elements that can be found in the literary works. I will not explain further in detail about these extrinsic and intrinsic elements, since this is just the introductions. So I will tell you the similarities and the differences between these two different kinds of elements in literary works. So now let's go to see the similarities between the extrinsic and the intrinsic elements. Basically, there are two similarities between these two kinds of elements in literary works. The first one is that both are equally important in the process of creating the works of literature. Thus, we cannot think that the extrinsic elements are more important than the intrinsics or vice versa. Both are equally important. In this first similarity, you can see in my writing there that I wrote in the process in blue font. I will explain it later when we discuss about the differences. Okay, now let's move on to the next similarity. So these elements influence the structural developments of the literary works. So without these two elements, the extrinsic and intrinsic elements, you cannot create the prose, poetry, or drama, because this helps us to create the idea or the imaginations to structurally develop the literary works. Without these elements, it's going to be really hard to produce the literary works, because everything that you make must be influenced consciously or unconsciously. So although the writer wants to reject the idea that he is not influenced by anything surrounding him when writing or when creating these works, that is impossible. There must be some kind of influence in certain degree. Alright, so these two are the similarities. Now we move on to the differences between these extrinsic and intrinsic elements. So here I will discuss three differences. The first one is the extrinsic elements means that it is found outside the works, while the intrinsic is inside the works. What does it mean? It means that you cannot directly analyze the extrinsic elements while reading the literary works. You have to have a background check on the authors, on the surrounding, on the situation, the conditions in which the work is created. Meanwhile, in the intrinsic elements, when you read something in the literary works, it can indicate the elements of the works. For example, the characters in the works, the conflicts in the works, etc. Okay, the next difference is related to the time when these elements influence the creating of the literary works. So the extrinsic elements mostly influence the writers or the authors before and or in the process of producing the works. So he or she must conduct some kind of research or survey, or make some kind of reflections to his or herself to get the background idea or imaginations in creating the works. While in the process, these extrinsic elements will still influence the writers to adjust the writing to whatever comes up in his or her mind based on his or her experience. While the intrinsic elements can influence and can be analyzed in the process and or after creating the works. So in the process of producing the works, the writer or authors will then decide, for example, the characters, the plot, the rhyme or rhythm that he or she is going to use in the works, and then after the work is done, he or she might have to make some kind of changes. He or she needs to change something in the story to make it as perfect as possible, according to him or her. Right, so the last difference is that the extrinsic elements is actually applicable to all kinds of literary works. So there is no any exclusive elements for the prose, the poetry, and drama. One kind of extrinsic elements, for example, the socio-economical background of the author, can influence the writers of prose, poetry, and drama. so it's not limited to a certain literary work. Differently, some kinds of intrinsic elements are actually exclusive to a certain kind of literary work. For example, the intrinsic elements in prose basically refers to those of characters, conflicts, points of view, and so on. And you cannot use this when you want to create a poem, for example. So the intrinsic elements for the poetry will be much different from those of prose and drama. For example, in poetry you will have imagery, the rhythm, the rhyme, etc. So those are the difference between the extrinsic and intrinsic elements. To make it easier for us to see further, we can see this circle. This is the circle of literary works, which consists of prose, poetry, and drama. We can see that inside this circle is what we call as the intrinsic element. So anything inside the circle are the intrinsic elements. For example, like the plot, and then the conflict, and then what else you have? You have the rhyme, and then the imagery, and then the dialogue. So these are the intrinsic elements, while anything outside the circle is called the extrinsic elements. Sorry for my bad handwriting. Okay, so what are these extrinsic elements? It can be, for example, like the socio-economical background of the writer, or it can be the cultural environment, or maybe it's the author's psychological background or condition. So these are the things that needs to be paid attention more when you want to analyze the extrinsic and the intrinsic elements of the literary works. Hopefully this short video can explain much about the similarities and differences between the extrinsic and intrinsic elements. Okay, that's all, and thank you.